Today we're doing acorn squash. We're going to stuff it with apples and raisins. So we're going to get started. I've got a couple of tablespoons of raisins. If you like raisins a lot, feel free to add more. You could also substitute another kind of dried fruit. So if you had dried cranberries, for instance, those would also be really good. I'm going to cover it, and there's no measurement on this. I've got some warm water. We're just going to put on enough to cover the raisins, and we're going to let them plump for up to 10 minutes. That way that water is going to get absorbed, and then we're going to drain that water off, and we're going to go ahead and use them later. All right, I'm also going to use an acorn squash. Now when you use any kind of produce like this, one of the things you want to remember is you want to wash it well. So even though you're not going to be eating this part of it, make sure that you wash it before you start working with it. I've cut it in half. I'm going to cut it in half once more, and I've seeded it. And I used a grapefruit spoon. I found that those work quite well to get all the, because they have the ridges on them, they are pretty good at taking off the seeds and other strands here. This is going to go in a 8x8 or a 9-inch pan. And I'm going to spray it just a little bit with some vegetable spray, and that's going to keep it moist. I'm going to put it in a 375-degree oven. You don't need to cover it or anything, just like this, and it's going to stay in there for about 10 minutes. All right, while that's baking, it's going to be in there 10 minutes. That's going to be the first bake. It's going to take less time than a lot of times the things we do with acorn squash at a little bit lower temperature because we cut it into smaller pieces, and anytime you cut things into smaller pieces, you're going to speed up the cooking process a little bit. So rather than cooking it whole or in a half, this will move it along. Now we need to get some of the other things ready that we're going to put in this. I've got a tablespoon of butter. I'm just going to put that in the pan while we're waiting on it and put it over a low heat. I don't want it to burn, but I do want it to start getting melted. And then an apple. Again, make sure you wash it well. Now with apples, almost all the apples in the US are going to be coated with some kind of a wax unless they are your own. The wax is edible. It's nothing that you need to be concerned about. But if you are worried about the wax, make sure that you wash it. There's really not a good way to remove it, but it only takes a couple of drops of wax to coat an apple. So it's not a lot of wax that we're dealing with. When you do wash it, make sure that you wash it in cool water, however. And this is really important if you wash the apples when you bring them home from the store, because if you wash them in warm water, that wax is going to turn cloudy or white, and you don't want that. That's not going to look good, and then people will worry about the wax on your apple. So I've used an apple core to get the core out. You could use, just cut them in quarters and remove that core as well. This works a little bit faster, but I do want to take the stem ends off where the stem actually exists. And then we're going to cut these into about 1/2-inch pieces. When we get those cut, we're going to put them into the pan with the melted butter, but it's not quite ready yet, so I'm going to hold off on that. The variety of apple that you use is also going to make a little bit of a difference. We want to use an apple that's going to hold up to cooking. So there are lots of varieties that will do that. I'm using Fuji's. You could use a Golden Delicious. You could use the traditional Granny Smith that a lot of us use for baking. But there are a lot of other varieties that are less well known this time of year, or that you may be growing. If you've used them in cooking and they've held their shape fairly well, that's fine. That's the one you'll want to use. The other thing I'm going to get ready here is a little bit of cinnamon and sugar. That's about 1/4 to 1/8 of a teaspoon. And here you can kind of go with, if you like cinnamon a lot, go ahead and use the larger amount. And you could also use a sugar substitute or a sugar replacement here if you chose to. Just make sure that the one you use is one that will stand up to the heat. And this we're going to sprinkle over the squash when we get it out of the oven in that 10-minute time block. So we're just going to be sort of holding on things when the butter is melted. Let's go ahead and put this in. It's not quite all melted, but we'll go ahead. We're going to put the apples in. We're going to put about half of our sugar and cinnamon mixture in. And we're going to drain the raisins, and we're going to put those in as well. And then we'll stir those together, and those are going to be ready to go over the squash when we take it out of the oven, and that'll be another 30 to 35 minutes that that's going to go ahead and cook. So the raisins were drained, stir those together. I've turned the heat off, and this is just going to wait for us until we're ready for it. All right, that first short baking is done. So now let's fix these up a little bit. First thing I'm going to do is sprinkle the other half of the sugar and cinnamon on. We're doing it now because I forgot to put it on before we put it on in the oven in the first time, so we're kind of catching up with it. But I would recommend that you go ahead and sprinkle it on before you put it in the oven, before you bake it that first 10 minutes. This is just going to add a lot of flavor, a little bit of sweetness. This is one of those vegetables that a lot of times gets a lot more sweetness added to it, a lot more fat added to it than it needs to, similar to sweet potatoes. So we're going to try and lighten it up a little bit here. And we're going to get a lot of sweetness still, but we're going to get it from these apples and the raisins. And just put these over. They don't all have to land in the core, but we want to get them all in there and into the oven. We're going to put them back in the oven. This is going to take somewhere between 30 to 35 minutes. Depends if you pierce the squash and or the apples with a knife and they're tender, it's going to be done. You just need to prick these with a knife or a fork to make sure they're tender all the way through. Oh, this smells terrific. That cinnamon's coming up. And then you get 4 servings. Make sure that you serve all of the apples and the raisins along with it so that everybody gets some of everything. Again, this is a great way to increase some of those yellow vegetables that a lot of us are short on. Kids tend to like it because it's got the sweetness of the apples and the raisins. I hope you'll try this one. It's acorn squash stuffed with apple and raisins. For Oklahoma Gardening, I'm Barbara Brown.